And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Larissa Raphael.
Thank you, Lisa. So today we are going to talk about programs and resources that we offer for early learners through both family and school programs here at MoMA. And also we'll cover how we've adapted these offerings in the pandemic. We'll share how we connect to kids, families, and teachers with modern and contemporary art and ideas. We'll also share best practices that we've developed for on-site programming, but also discuss what we've learned facilitating online art workshops for early learners. And at the end, as Lisa mentioned, we hope to hear not only your questions, but also to hear your ideas about what strategies and adaptations you've discovered and what best practices you have in your classroom. And I'm going to pass it on to Carrie, and if we can start the slides, please.
Hello again. So family programs at MoMA include free programs and resources designed for families with kids ages 4 to 14. The programs we offer include gallery conversations, artist talks, film screenings, art workshops, activity stations, and other special events. You can see families participating in a painting workshop in the photo on the left, and on the right, families are in our galleries doing an activity station together. Traditionally, our programs have occurred at the museum, but we've adapted to offering online programs during the pandemic, which you'll hear more about soon. In before times, programs took place on the weekends roughly following the school year. Recently, though, we've been offering more programs in the late afternoon and have made adult participation optional as we recognize caregivers are fulfilling more roles than ever right now and might not be able to participate. In addition to programs, we develop resources for kids and families. Some are meant to be enjoyed during a visit, like activity booklets, audio guides, and kids labels, as well as our interactive space for families, the Heyman Family Art Lab, all of which you can see pictured here. Other resources we develop help extend our reach beyond the museum, like our children's books and art making kits. Historically, the goals of family programs were fairly simple. They were to engage families with works of art, engage families with each other, and engage families with the institution. And I think you can see those goals embodied in this photograph with the son leaning against his dad while they look together at an iconic work in MoMA's collection. Over the course of this past year, though, we've adapted our goals after checking in with ourselves, evaluating what we were doing well and how we could improve, and also thinking about our audience needs. So now for our online workshops, we strive to encourage close looking of art and objects, make sure participants feel seen or heard and have an opportunity to express themselves, and share multiple perspectives, both from the artists and participants. We also are working to decenter the artwork of white male artists and designers. And we're hoping to engage a wider variety of ages in any given program than we had previously. And as I mentioned before, we're not relying on caregivers to participate. So now I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Amber, who will talk more about the ways we approach family audiences.
Thanks so much, Carrie. So there are a number of ways that we approach family audiences. First, it feels important to note that we don't just serve kids, we center families and all of their many forms in our programming. As a team, we rely on caregivers to introduce their kids to the museum and to our programs and resources. However, when adults are available and present, they can be really great assets in who support their young learners during programs. So during programs, adults might assist with projects or collaborate with young learners. They can also help scaffold ideas and activities. So for example, they might help kids go from observation of an artwork to interpretation. We very intentionally model techniques for caregivers so that they have examples of how to engage with their kids around art. And we find that it can be extremely valuable for young learners to see their caregivers being creative. And at the same time, this can feel enriching for the caregivers themselves, who might not have the time or might not usually stop to look closely at art, or might not have made art themselves since they were in school. So the methods or tools that we use to engage kids and families, both on-site and online, include themes, inquiry-based and guided discussions, activities that encourage family interaction and participation, though we have dialed back on that, as mentioned, and age-appropriate vocabulary and information. So as you all have learned in the courses, in the Department of Education here at MoMA, we use universal themes that help ground programs in ideas and experiences that families are already familiar with. So some themes that work well for younger learners include people, places, line, shape, color, and materials and techniques. So the images you see here on this slide are of our art lab space, which is currently closed, unfortunately, but we designed the space around the theme of line, shape, and color. So the photo on the left shows our line composition station, where kids and their grown-ups can weave and create different arrangements with lines. And on the right is a photo of a child working on our light box, which projects their creations onto the wall. So inquiry-based discussion is a key element of our programming. Programs are designed to be conversational, but still very much guided by the educator. Participants are asked to articulate and provide visual evidence for their interpretations. And all the while, educators are organizing and connecting interpretations and encouraging discussion and allowing for multiple perspectives, while always connecting the conversation back to the lesson goals and objectives. So when we talk about activities here, we are referring to components of the lesson that are not purely conversational in nature. This could be sketching, shape composition, writing lists or stories, or movement. Activities are always connected to the theme and to the artwork. They should involve close looking or adding additional perspective to the work. Educators should be able to introduce the activity with simple and clear instructions. And after the activity, you should be able to return to the artwork for further discussion. Activities that can be introduced at different times during a program. So in addition to encouraging close looking at an artwork, they can be used in the middle of a program to try out an artist's process, or at the end as a final assessment of whether participants understood the big ideas of the lesson. We try to include a range of activities that tap into different learning modalities like drawing, movement, or sound. We do definitely consider age when planning for activities. Like, we know that younger kids need more tactile and movement-based activities. And we also think about how caregivers and kids will be involved. So as I mentioned earlier, we want, whenever possible, for adults to be fully participating in the experience, not just casually observing. And depending on the activity and the ages of the kids, families might do an activity together or work independently or have specific roles. And this might be something that you want to think about doing for at-home activities with your students. We find this is really helpful because it gives the adult a role, both so that they will participate and so that they won't overtake the child's participation. So the final big tool I'm going to talk about is age-appropriate vocabulary and information that's connected to works of art. So when we're sharing information, we try to make sure the info is essential to what we want to share about the artwork in that specific context. We'll often show an image of the artist so participants can make a connection to that real person that made it. And we try to insert the artist's voice whenever possible so that kids can hear directly from the artist about their work. And finally, we try to include information in lots of different ways. So instead of just sharing facts, we might share a quote from the artist, or a letter, or a poem, or a video. So for example, on the slide here on the left is the work, The Dove by Romare Bearden. And I know that Bearden's work explores Black experiences, including his own. So I might share the quote on the right, which says, "My purpose is to paint the life of my people as I know it." So thinking specifically about early learners, there's a number of ways that we specifically approach early learners as well. First, we will introduce families to the museum visiting experience and to MoMA. So some kids that come to our programs have never been to a museum before, and some adults as well. And I personally find it really exciting to be able to provide that first experience for them. We approach our youngest learners through the concept of learning to look. And in this, we model various techniques for making observations and thinking and talking about artworks, because we know that this may be a completely new experience for both adults and kids. We also try to engage early learners' developmental strengths through hands-on explorations, movement, and imagination. So, for example, we know that young kids learn with their whole bodies. So to tap into that, we might have them take the body position of someone in a work of art. And finally, as previously mentioned, we create clear opportunities for caregiver involvement. So for example, we might ask an adult to pose while their child is drawing. So I'm now going to turn over the virtual mic to my colleague, Larissa, who's going to share some insights from the school programs team.
Thank you, Amber. Yes, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we have always pre-pandemic worked with early learners through our school visits program. And generally our school visits program had started at kindergarten. So that's loosely around 5 years old, and to second grade, which is around, well, it goes to 12 years old, but in early learners, I'm talking about kindergarten through second grade, which is around 8 years old. Many of the strategies that family programs mentioned are also used in school programs. We also work with themes, and we offer thematic tours that teachers can choose. And up to very recently, the most popular option for younger learners was characters and spaces and places for our themes, which as I'll mention later, we had to rethink a little bit. And the tours for younger learners were 1 hour long rather than 75 minutes, which is what they are for older elementary, middle school, and high school groups. And while we always use activities in all K through 12 tours, with early elementary ages, we introduce many more activities and many more multimodal activities. In the photo on the left, you can see students engaged in a movement activity, and you can see it's in an empty gallery, and on the right, you can see students drawing in front of a work of art. And as you can see also in the images, the biggest difference between school programs and is how we engage adults and families. You can see that there's fewer adults participating. So for our purposes, it's much more important to engage with the teacher and learn about the classroom community and learn about the classroom culture to maintain continuity between the classroom and museum. So thinking about how do teachers get students' attention? How do students have conversations? What's the culture of conversations? How do they indicate agreement or disagreement? And these are very important things, especially for younger learners this might be their first time in a museum, so having those familiar processes is extra important. So with the universal pre-K being introduced in New York City and growing very quickly, we decided to pilot a program to bring pre-K students into the museums. And our initial thinking when we started planning was that we just wanted to adapt what we did already with early elementary ages to 4-year-olds. And we considered attention span, the time it takes to walk through the museums, and how important it was to introduce the experience of just being in a new space. And it all takes more time with this age group. We wanted to plan the program also for the spring, out of consideration that student development throughout the year is exponential, and their comfort with their teacher and classmates grows throughout the year. So our program initially it was 45 minutes, consisted of 15 minutes of introduction, and that was an introduction to the theme as well as museum behaviors, really spelling those out more than we would with other students. 15 minutes going into galleries, We made sure that students would come in before the museum opening hours because MoMA does get very busy. And we would look at one artwork and do some movement, some activity, either movement or some other kind of quick activity in front of the work of art. And then the last 15 minutes would be a short art making inspired by the work of art. The challenges for us was getting students to the museum before opening hours when the museum is least crowded, because with 4-year-old attention spans and how busy MoMA gets, it would have been impossible to do it during museum hours. There's busing restrictions for 4-year-olds in New York City, so very few schools could actually get to the museum. And we also found that material prep for our educators was time consuming because 4-year-old students just needed a lot more assistance with materials. But we did find that students were very successful in the galleries. They were able to focus on one work of art, and teachers really appreciated being able to bring their students to the museum, both because it kind of helped them model what a school trip would be that they would go on throughout the rest of their school lives, but also it was exposure to a new place, and they really enjoyed it. So next slide, thank you. So taking everything that we learned in January of 2020, we started a full pre-K program, which was sadly interrupted by the pandemic. So we weren't able to see it through completely, but we moved away, for this program, we moved away from the model of classes visiting the museum and decided on 3 sessions in the school focusing on line, shape, color, which partly we did to align with the family art lab at the time. So for line, the lesson was about wire sculpture. For shape, the lesson was about cutouts, which you can see on the right, and with the Matisse image. And the color, it was mark making and color blending, which you can see inspired by an image by Alma Thomas. So we also, a big part of this program was also to encourage family visitation, which we did through sending a letter home with everything from introductions, directions, and passes up to 5 people for free admission. And we wanted them to come to the museum. We didn't want to eliminate the museum visit altogether, but it was with families. So our takeaways were that since we focused on line, shape, color for this program, we taught with a lot of abstract art. And we realized that much of art education for early elementary, and that included art programming, leaned toward representational art. And if you remember, our most popular themes were spaces and places and characters. So one of our big takeaways is we introduced a lot more abstract art for all of our early learners, and that really opened up our collection and the kind of conversations that we could have. And with this age group, we did find that families became much more important. So with programs that happened in the museum, we needed many more chaperones than we would for a regular school visit. And when we moved the program into the classroom, families became the way that students would get to the museum. So engaging them became much more important. And this was all pre-pandemic that I'm talking about. And now I'm going to pass it on to Liz, who will talk a little bit more about how these museum education methodologies translated into an online setting.
Thanks, Larissa. Since the museum closed in March, we've tried a variety of methods and platforms to connect with kids and families. We've published articles with activity ideas that parents can facilitate on their own, which many of which you can see on the screen right now, very small. We've led small and large group live art workshops on Zoom. We've created asynchronous art making videos for YouTube and Facebook, and led live virtual talks with artists and designers. We'll go into a little bit more detail about the live art making programs in a moment. Early on, we surveyed families to learn how we could best support them during these challenging times, and learn families have all sorts of needs, and that those needs change from season to season or even by school district. Some families said that their kids were zoomed out, while others were desperate for weekly, for weekly online experiences to help their kids connect with others in a creative way. We've been collaborating with school and teacher programs colleagues because, as you know, the lines between home and school have blurred this year, and Larissa will talk a little bit more about this later. Next slide, please. Thank you. For our live art making programs, we started with small group workshops over the summer that were more closely related to our in-person tours and workshops. On the screen, you can see an image of an artwork by Alma Thomas called Flight, and an image of me, and I'll talk about that in a moment. In an effort to expand our reach, we tried new formats that could accommodate a larger audience in the fall. In doing so, we needed to cut verbal response and use other ways for kids to participate and engage. For both formats, small and large, we had to adjust the amount and style of inquiry and discussion we included. It's still there, but it's muted and it's a little bit different. When we ask questions in an online lesson, we offer different ways that kids can respond, whether we can hear their response or not. And these include verbally, in small groups, or in breakout groups, which we've been experimenting with a lot, in the chat, by copying emotion. For example, asking the child to trace a line that they see in a work of art with their finger. Striking a pose, which you can see I am doing in this image here when I ask kids to pose like the little girl in the artwork. If they're with a caregiver, inviting them to share their ideas with whomever they're with, especially with younger learners. We also invite them to draw and to write, and we invite simple prompts, simple moments of agreement, like the good old thumbs up. Next slide, please. Thank you. Over the past year, we've also really tried to take responsibility for the impact that the content of our programs has on our audience. We have developed DEAI goals and articulated values that direct how we make programming decisions within our team, across the museum, and with outside collaborators. Being in the virtual world, we've been able to really commit to focus on diverse voices and artists. This is Betty Starr in the image. She's wearing a blue sweater with arms crossed and a big smile. She's posing in her garden next to one of her sculptures. Online, we're not tied to looking at works of art on the museum's walls. We can celebrate artists and artworks that may not have been given space in the past, and can even highlight those that aren't in our collection. This year, we've also introduced social and emotional techniques into our virtual programs. We started using breathing and grounding exercises at the start of our workshops, and our themes have focused on well-being and kindness, such as places you would like to visit, or designing spaces for someone you care about. Over the last few months, we've also ramped up our accessibility efforts. These include verbal description, offering PDFs of slides with alt text, and making families know how to use captioning. The online experience has been both challenging and transformative for us. It's forced us to slow down and really think about our choices and how we impact our audience. Next slide, please. So here are our takeaways for virtual programming. Use materials that can be easily sourced or that families are likely to have at home. Images have power. So make sure the artwork can be seen clearly on a small screen, or that you zoom in so that the families can get a closer look. Introduce diverse artists and voices to help expand families' ideas of who an artist can be and whose art matters. Use music to help set the tone, connect the group during individual art making, and change the energy of the program. Always leave time for sharing and provide space for kids to talk, even if it's just for a short amount of time. Also, provide resources. There's only so much that we can cover in an hour. So sharing links to children's books, videos, or even works of art can help extend their experience. So now I'm going to turn it back to Larissa, who will talk about resources for teachers, parents, and caregivers.
Thank you, Liz. So as Liz mentioned, in acknowledgement of the reality that the lines between schools and families, parents and teachers have really been blurred, we've started providing resources that are flexible and can be used both in the classroom and at home. We started last spring with Mondays with MoMA, which some of you might be familiar with, and you might already be on our distribution list. And if you're not, feel free to sign up. If somebody can drop that into the chat. And these were simple online lessons consisting of an artwork, some guided questions, information, and an art making activity. And this was meant, again, to be very simple so that teachers could just take it and run with it without having to do extra work or extra prep. And this includes, I'm including parents in the teacher category. And then we heard from a lot of parents and teachers with younger learners that they were looking for resources specifically designed for pre-K, kindergarten, first grade, second grade audiences. So we paired up with family programs to create artful activities for early learners. And these were designed around a similar structure as Mondays with MoMA, but really we wanted to make them more multimodal, tapping into the strengths of this age group. So we also thought about themes that pre-K and preschool learners might be covering in their classrooms. So the themes included seasons, people, elements in art, so line, shape, color, pattern, and as well as social emotional learning. And here you can see one of our lessons about thinking about moments of kindness, featuring a photograph by Helen Levitt. And we're hoping that very shortly, within the next week, the archive of all of these lessons, both the artful activities and Mondays with MoMA, will be on MoMA.org. And we'll share that with you in a follow-up email. And I also just want to mention, we've been creating video lessons, both family programs and school programs, that teachers and parents can play whenever needed. And again, focused on looking at art, having conversations, and doing activities, but keeping it very flexible. And that's a very brief overview of kind of how we've adapted our resources to online learning. And I will pass it on to Lisa so we can start our question and answer session.
Great, thank you. And I'll be joined by our amazing team. That was really great. You know, we've all been forced to really adapt our teaching practices and be super agile right now. And we'd love, as we're answering questions, for you all to continue to share, you know, some best practices or strategies that you have, because I'm sure there's a lot that we could also learn from you. So we're going to start the Q&A, continue to put them into the chat, but we'll start with a couple of questions that were posted previously in the discussion forum. So we're going to start with a crafty Arab who asks, and I'm going to throw this first to my colleague, Francis, how can we bring more diversity into the classroom with limited resources? If a teacher wants to do an art lesson about a European artist, the resources in children's books are unlimited. Yet when I try to teach about an Arab artist, I'm unable to find picture books or child-friendly resources. So I think this is a really great question. So I'll kick it over to you, Francis.
All right, thank you for sending this this well thought out question. It is really tough to find something, especially an art lesson about people from Arab nations, when you don't really have anything in mind. And just to share something, I'm going to put something in the chat. It's a link to an artist named Mona Hatoum, who's in MoMA's collection. And I'm sharing this because I did a program a few months ago about teaching with Asian American artists from the collection. And one of my colleagues actually talked about Mona Hatoum and what it meant to be able to see you know, Arabic script in artwork. So my suggestion is, one, you don't necessarily have to look for just stories of Arab artists for children. Sometimes you can look at these visual cues and see if you can share them with people. For example, just a script alone, it could be something that's familiar to a lot of learners that they don't usually get to see. Another option would be, looking at different artists who are talking about different stories based on their cultures. I'm going to share another work, this time by a Chinese artist named Saigo Chang. And it's based on some old stories from older dynasties. But the main thing is a lot of artworks, visual art, will have these visual cues that kids will pick up on. I know that I'm going to pass it over to Liz because she's also going to have suggestions on lists and children's books as well.
Thanks, Francis. Yeah, I think this is a great question, and it led me to look a little bit more closely at our collection, because it's true. I think sometimes it's really hard to surface artists in any collection, really. And one thing that I did is just a kind of a tip for our website, and it may work for others as well, is to if there is a searchable, if there's an ability to search a collection, is to actually put in the country that an artist might come from. So I did a quick search of our collection, and I first put in Egypt. And I came back with a lot of artists that first had depicted Egypt in some way in their artwork, but then I was actually able to dig a little deeper and find artists who were from Egypt. And I kept on kind of going through those through Arab nations to find actually a nice list of artists in our collection from Iran and Lebanon and Sudan. And so just by doing that and doing that work, I started to collect a list of artists in our collection. And in terms of looking for children's books with Arab characters, I have found that being very direct with the internet and saying, I'm looking for children's books with Arab characters, and you'll find quite often that people have put a list together and are willing to share that list. And one suggestion, and when we were talking about this, I would have is, if you do create a list of artists or children's books, share it. And especially with the Coursera community, you've got kind of a group that would probably be very welcoming to hear what you have found. And I encourage you to all share the list of resources you have created or things that you've found in that community.
That's great. Thank you, both of you. And just to tag on to Liz's point, you should definitely respond if you have such resources already in the works to the discussion forum thread that's already in the course. That's a great idea to keep seeding that with other resources from the community. So now we have a question from Brenda. Hopefully, Brenda, I got the translation correct on your question. And if you're here and I get it wrong, you can always clarify in the chat. And she says, faced with the health emergency, activities have been transformed virtually. And in this situation, how can we activate participation of students and work towards some community activities? So, and I'm going to read this again. So faced with a health emergency and these activities being virtual, in this situation, how can active participation of students be achieved? And are there ways that some community activities can be developed in a virtual space? And I think I'm going to give this one to you, Larissa, to start us off.
Sure. I just have a couple of ideas off the top of my head. I think granted, it's so hard to join in, community art making activities or conversation in the virtual space. But I kept thinking about kind of joint art making activities that you can do still at a distance. One thing that we love doing in the galleries with different ages of students is play Exquisite Corpse, which is a surrealist game. Many of you might be familiar. One person draws the head, and the other person draws the body, and the last person draws the feet. Or you can do this with any subject matter, and you can exchange this through the mail. You can kind of add it, pass it along in different ways. If your students aren't all in the classroom on the same day, you can have students pass it along to students that they might not see in a regular classroom day. So that's just that's an example. We also just, Francis, Lisa, and I just were talking about an activity inspired by a Magritte painting we have in the collection that has a daytime sky and a nighttime street scene. And thinking about, you can even have students paint two different parts of a landscape and combine them together. So really thinking about new ways to build community. And I also would say, and this is something we've been emphasizing, is sharing and group critique, thinking about making sure there's opportunities for students to share their work. If they're in a classroom and they can do that, there's also a really great skill to have students learn how to give feedback on artwork. And that's a great community building skill by supporting each other. But also we encourage students to send in their artwork. And that's, I think, really important for students who might be home by themselves and they want somebody to look at their work, because as we know, students love sharing and getting feedback on what they do. So that's just two things that I think are just off the top of my head came to mind. And I don't know if anybody else has other ideas.
I was just thinking about, Larissa, to add on to that, some of the tech platforms, the technology we've been hearing from partner schools. Like I'm thinking about things like Padlet and Flipgrid, and there's so many online tools that people are using as well for students to share. And also we have a partner school where the entire school community, the parents, caregivers, and the students all go to Flipgrid and do collaborative sharing on various topics. So the great thing is there's all these interesting platforms out there to kind of ease some of that communication. So now I'm going to go with a question, Carrie Frisch. I'm going to give this one to you. And so this is from Laura. She posted, Laura Gabriel. She posted this in the chat, and she says, "How do we engage family participation and activities in an art inquiry lesson during the current social restrictions?" Carrie, do we lose you? You might be muted.
Sorry, it's a classic Carrie move there. Just gave me time to practice my answer. We have not offered on-site programs over the course of this last year with the pandemic. So figuring out how to have families interact with each other and with other families is a challenge that we will have to figure out in the near future. But we do, have resources for families who are visiting on their own. For instance, we have the Hey Kids Family Activity Guide that we are offering up. That is a way that families can explore the museum together through different movement or drawing or writing activities. And we also have kids labels that are up too. So that's something that, if you're having a socially distanced visit, you can, check the labels and you don't need to touch anything or, anything like that to enjoy those. But so for the time being, we're focusing mostly on online engagement, especially when it comes to programming. We recently launched a new program called Make Art Together that's meant for 4 to 6-year-olds to do alongside an adult. In the program, we invite participants to do art making projects together. They can do them on their own also if they want, but that's a very similar tactic to what we do in our on-site workshops, where we either, are very specific about how we want adults to engage in the project. If it's a gallery program too, we might say specifically, adults, you draw something while your kid describes it. Just assigning roles we find can help, from parents maybe taking over an art project for kids, or just gives them a clue as to what they can be doing. Anyway, so we also acknowledge that a lot happens off screen for families. And I know that there's a question later on that I'll just start to jump on a little bit, that we don't require families to turn on their cameras. And we've actually found that families can be very engaged, even if their cameras are off. With some of the workshops we've been experimenting with, we've had breakout groups, and sometimes at the end, the families, when they've shared in those breakout groups, they then turn their camera on, and we see that they've been like actively participating in making things. They just didn't feel comfortable having their camera on for whatever reason. I also know as a parent with a young learner that we've had our camera off sometimes because my son felt shy, but we're still having a great experience and actively participating. Sorry, that was a big digression.
No, that's fine. Carrie, did you want to,
yeah.
would you be willing to just tag on a little bit? I just see that Louisa put in the chat a question about MoMA's tactile tours pre-pandemic, and maybe you just want to speak a little bit about, you know, what you were doing on site. And I mean, you've already spoken to some of that, but maybe just flesh that out.
Yeah. So our programs were all multimodal, so that they involved, they weren't just conversation. There was a lot of conversation, especially for younger learners, that there was a tactile element to the program, whether it was a movement exercise, that's not tactile, I'm realizing, whether it was a movement exercise or, if it was a program that was focused on materials, the educator might have had materials for the kids and families to touch themselves. Our interactive space art lab was also a tactile environment. And that was something that really, I think, made visitors' experience to the museum, especially for kids, because they can only spend so much time not touching when they're in the galleries on their own, even if there's if there's an activity book or something like that for them to do. So that was a place where they could start to create their own meaning, and they could respond to some of the art that they'd seen, or just engage with their own creativity in that space. Liz and Amber, feel free to hop on. I feel like I'm starting to digress.
Well, I was just going to throw something at Liz, unless you want to add on to that.
Yeah,
otherwise,
sure.
Okay.
Nope.
So Louisa Goss, I think this might be a different Louisa, was asking, and you talked about this a little bit, about relaxation and well-being resources through creativity for young children online. So maybe you can reference what you're doing in your programs again, and then Larissa, maybe you even want to then come in and talk a little bit about well-being and our programming.
Sure. Everything I've learned from the school programs team, I'll be honest. Or honestly, from watching my own son, I've noticed that our local school has really, with online learning, has introduced a lot of social and emotional techniques. Some of the things that we've done are, and quite honestly, I go to the internet when I'm looking for something, depending on what we try to do is honor the fact that we're moving into a different moment. We have no idea where the kids, what they've been doing before or after. Quite honestly, when we were in the museum, if we started a program, we didn't know if the kids had come from soccer or ballet. So taking a moment to just say, hey, we're all here together. This is a new moment. We're all going to focus and be together in this moment. So online, we might do some kind of a breathing exercise. Amber did one recently, which was simply just to, it was smell the flower and blow out the candle. And you do that a couple of times. And it's just about getting yourself centered and breathing. We do a lot about, making sure that you're grounded, you're comfortable, you're maybe you have a glass of water, but your feet are touching the ground. I was doing a workshop this week that was focusing on imagined places. So we did kind of a guided technique of thinking about a place that brings you comfort and relaxes you, and asked a couple of questions about senses, imagining what it would smell like, or it sound like, or feel like in that place, which was actually very related to the exercise we were doing, where we were looking at works of art, where you were imagining what it would feel like to be in that place, what it would smell like, feel like, what you would hear. So a lot of it is just about preparation, preparing you and centering you and getting you ready for the work ahead.
Great.
Larissa?
Larissa, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I think our approach has been, especially, I'm going to talk specifically through our asynchronous resources and our lessons. because I think what we've been trying to do, and school programs has been working with kind of thinking about how we can use art for social emotional learning for a while. And I think we've been really trying to infuse all our programming with it. And I really even think that our inquiry-based approach and teaching students how to have conversations and how to share is a social and emotional learning skill. And we've really tried to make sure that, you know, thinking about how can we do that, but not call it out as something different or something new that students have to learn, because that can sometimes for students and families be intimidating to think of, oh no, I have to do this new different thing. And it's something that's a lot of, like Liz mentioned, that students already do in school. And so it's really just infusing all our programming with that. So it could be something like choosing an artwork that has to do with hope and have students engage with this idea of what does hope mean to them, and choosing artworks that allow them to explore different ideas and questions. And I think that kind of connects to a question I see in the conversation by Ilario, who asks, may you suggest any activities or artworks artists to explain current pandemic to an early learner through art? And I think back to a lesson that we did back in the spring, and we used Jacob Lawrence as an example of somebody who used art to tell a story about a specific time. And we got some really interesting artworks, and we said, reflect on the time that we're living in. And we got amazing artworks about students drawing what their coronavirus experience was, them in masks, drawing big germs, drawing big, you know, this really interesting things about seeing how students were processing this time. So I would say my biggest suggestion is you don't necessarily have to find a work of art that is about COVID that was made in 2020 or 2021. It could be another work of art that just talks about how people express their ideas. And I think we also can share later on, C Learning from Emory University has specific resources that they've developed for the pandemic. So we can also either share them in the link or afterwards in a follow-up email.
I just put actually that link in the chat. There's several resources there, and one of them from C Learning does refer to the pandemic, so you can see that. I also put a link in back to the wellness techniques. A very good colleague from one of our partner schools, the principal of the school, uses these brain breaks as part of this Pure Edge platform that has all their videos online, and there's movement exercises and breathing exercises and all different types of things for students and young people to use. So I just put those two links in the chat as well. And then the next question, so we have a question, and I think everyone can answer this, but whoever feels like they want to jump in first can respond, from Juan Esteban Ramirez from the chat. And he says, what are the main questions you're normally asking yourselves in order to improve on these ideas and methods? They sound great, and they clearly have a focused direction, but Juan, thank you for that question. I think that's a very important question, and I know my colleagues have thoughts about that. So would anyone like to start?
I'll say one thing, and that's that we try to have audience members and participants weigh in, that we do a good amount of surveys and evaluations in our programs. Obviously, when they're on site, we could do more evaluations and observations, whether it was of a resource or a program. And surveys are a regular part of our practice too. We really think about what we want to know. And then ask our audience, and then think about how that informs our next step. So I would say that is sometimes what's driving our questions. I also think some of it is just responding to the moment. You know, Liz and I I've been at MoMA for 15 years and Liz for even longer. We've worked together for a long time. And every year we seem to have some kind of special project, whether it was developing an app or art making kits. And this year I'd said to her earlier at the beginning of 2020, it kind of feels like we don't have like a special project this year. And then the pandemic came, and then all of a sudden we were totally adapting what we do. So I would say also the times kind of throw these questions to us too, where we would never have the robust online programming that we have today. If not for the pandemic. And I think a question would be what stays and what remains of these online programs that we've developed, because we've had this lovely international audience as we have here today, that how can we, continue to have our on-site programs or have on-site programs again, but to continue to have some kind of online presence. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but that's just sort of some of the things that came to mind. I think we're constantly, trying to do better. And reevaluating our audience's needs. I think another thing too is we're trying to broaden and grow our audience, and so that is also what's at the heart of some of the changes that we're making to the programs that we offer.
That's great.
I would just add, can I just add to that, which is exactly what we're all doing here today, which is trying to find our community. And you can often get very focused on whatever's in front of you, what your audience, and what we've found here, family and school. We always knew they were connected, but they're so it's so mixed now. And so we've really enjoyed working so much more closely with our school programs colleagues who really have been focusing on social and emotional learning. And so being able to have somebody else's perspective and share what they've been doing has been really wonderful. And so I encourage you to continue to share your ideas in this community, because you are the ones who are asking the questions. There is often somebody who has the answer. We're all kind of muddling through this together. But it is really great also to have somebody else watch, especially if you're doing virtual learning, inviting someone to watch your class if that's possible. I find it's really helpful to have, we can be very critical of our work, but sometimes there's somebody else watching and said, no, you didn't realize that child wasn't speaking, but they were drawing the entire time. So they were engaging in their own way. So having another set of eyes is really quite helpful. And so I think that, again, the idea of community has been really helpful as we try to figure out what we want to work on next.
And I'm just going to add something. I know, Larissa, if I don't answer this regarding the feedback process, we also, through the activities that we send out, we ask them to either email us back or tweet us back. And usually parents, teachers, or even students will send in the work that they did. And we kind of see what's happening, what's working, and we like to compliment what we like about what they did. But another thing about developing these activities and lessons, it's something we always ask is, would we want to do it? Does it excite us? Is it interesting for us as well? Especially if we're sending out to other people, we want to make sure that we want to do it as well.
Definitely, Francis. That was what I was getting at, and I think one of my favorite parts of my job currently, and I'm going to say this really quickly, is talking with colleagues and running an idea by somebody. And if it makes no sense to a colleague, it's not going to make sense to students. And having having a group of people that you trust who can who can give you that feedback. Sometimes Lisa will look at a question I'm asking. She's like, what do you actually want to know? What do you want them to answer? And it makes me realize that I have to refine my idea. We have to refine my activities. So I recommend just always trying out the activity and trying out a question before you present it to students.
That's great. That's all really great feedback. So it's just about 4:30 now. So we've run out of time. We're going to pop some last links into the chat. I know there was a question from Eva Taylor about children with blindness or visual impairment. So we're going to drop a link to a YouTube from a previous program we had with our colleagues in Access Programs. And hopefully someone can also drop a link in the chat to the Access Programs from MoMA.org. We are so happy that you could join us in this hour and spend this time with us. I invite my colleagues to, maybe we can all come on screen and say goodbye to everyone together. Maybe you're already there and I don't see you. I have to make my screen bigger. There's everyone. So thank you so much, everyone.